Well, as you know, we've been working through the book of Acts, and last week Wayne talked to us about the Ethiopian eunuch, and this week we're looking in Acts chapter 9 at the conversion of St. Paul. But in order to understand Paul and his conversion, we need to actually back up a little bit to set the scene. In Acts chapter 8, following the death of Stephen, we read these words: "And Saul approved of their killing of Stephen." And the important thing to note here is that Paul's approval of the killing of Stephen is not just that of a casual spectator in the crowd. He's not just someone in the crowd watching the stoning going on and thinking, well, yeah, that's a good thing, we need to get rid of this guy. His approval goes far deeper than that. Only a few verses earlier in chapter 7, we find Paul standing guard over the clothes of the witnesses. Now, the witnesses were those who brought the initial accusations against Stephen that led to his death. And under Jewish law, they were the ones who had to throw the very first stones, which I guess in a way is a way of bringing home to people the seriousness of their accusations, that you yourself have to believe in the truth of what you've said so strongly that you're willing to pick up a stone and throw it yourself. So to find Paul actually guarding the clothes of those very witnesses, I think places him very squarely in their camp. He obviously agreed that Stephen's Christian beliefs made him deserving of death. But why? Why? What was it that caused Paul to take this position? Why was he so against the Christians? What did he have against Christ? Well, what do we know about Paul so far? We know that he was an exceptional man. He studied under the best of Jewish teachers, namely Gamaliel. He studied at the university city of Tarsus, only second to Athens in the ancient world. He was a gifted writer. He obviously had great intelligence, and we know that he was a man who was extremely zealous at this stage for the Jewish faith. And I believe it was a combination of his zeal and his intelligence that enabled him to see clearly that there could be no compromise between Judaism and Christianity. There could be no compromise. Christianity claimed to be the fulfillment of all that Judaism looked and hoped for, a fulfillment that, if accepted, would radically change the way Judaism was practiced. It would not be possible for Judaism under the old function, under the old way, to continue any longer. So Paul saw clearly that if Judaism was to be preserved, was to survive even, then it had to rid itself of the Christian influence in its life and in its city. And it is to this task that Paul begins to apply himself zealously. Following Stephen's death, we're told that a great persecution broke out against the church, and all but the apostles were scattered. We're told that Paul went from house to house, dragging men and women off to prison. So intent was he on destroying the church. Now, it's very easy to skip over those verses without paying them, I think, too much attention. But stop and think for a moment. What would it take to cause you to flee your home? What would it take to cause you to flee Greymouth? To grab your children and some belongings and to throw them into the car and to flee Greymouth? What would it take to cause you to run away from this town? These people were afraid. They were afraid for their lives. They were afraid that Stephen's martyrdom was just the beginning. And our friend Paul was at the front of it all. And this is the scene, this is the character of Paul that we have to bear in mind when we come to look at his conversion. He was someone radically devoted to Judaism, so much so that it caused him to see what Christianity what Christianity could do to Judaism, and he wanted to destroy it. So let's turn now to Acts chapter 9 and pick up the story. In verses 1 and 2. Meanwhile Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, threats and murder, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound in chains to Jerusalem. The situation is now that the prey has fled. The Christians have left the city, and yet Paul is still not satisfied. We're told that he's breathing out murderous threats against the Christians. And it's an interesting phrase in the Greek, because It means that threats of wholesale slaughter had become like the very air that Paul breathed, so often did he say them. He had become a man obsessed with the church's destruction, so much so that he was willing to travel the 240 kilometres it took to get to Damascus to extradite any Jewish Christians who might have found refuge there. But as we know, this intention was never destined to be, because as he neared Damascus, something happened that would change his life forever. As he's trotting along on his horse, suddenly a light from heaven flashes around him. He falls to the ground and he hears a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he responds, "Who are you, Lord?" And the devastating reply comes, "I am Jesus. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Paul has had an encounter with the risen, glorified Christ. Now I think that for Paul there are a few things that would have hit him like a ton of bricks at that point, because if Jesus is glorified, and if this is a divine revelation, then Jesus is obviously with God, aligned with God. And if Jesus considers that an attack on the church is an attack on himself, then Paul, in the persecuting of the disciples, is not just attacking the church, not just attacking Jesus, he is in fact opposing the will of God. Paul has found himself where he is standing against God himself. And this realization must have come as an incredible shock for the man. Here he is thinking he is doing God's will by destroying the church, when in actual fact he discovers he's been working against God. What would that have done to this man? His whole world has been turned upside down. He's probably incredibly disorientated, he's confused, he needs time to think through and process everything that's just hit him in a really dramatic way at this point. And that's exactly what Jesus allows for him, I think, quite compassionately really. He's told in verse 6 to get up and to go into the city and to wait for further instruction. A side effect of the revelation is that he's been struck with blindness. Now that may have been mental shock, or it could have been something that God put upon him. But nothing about Paul's experience here is irrelevant. And I believe that Paul's blindness actually serves quite a distinct purpose in itself. Firstly, it's going to be a sharp reminder that everything he's experienced is real, that this isn't just something that made up, a delusion or something like that. Secondly, it would stress to him the enormity of his mistake. He was blind. He was blind to the truth. But, and I think this is the more important reason, it would also enable God to arrange events in such a way that it's the disciple Ananias who comes and prays for his healing. And we'll look at why that's more important in a few minutes. So Paul enters the city of Damascus. He's helped by his companions, and once there, he spends 3 days in a total fast. And that's significant as well, because a total fast is not like your average fast. You know, lots of people had partial fasts where they would, skip food from sunrise to sunset, or they might do a full fast where they don't eat for a few days, usually when trying to make an important decision. But a total fast is where you neither eat nor drink for 3 days at least. For 3 days. You can't actually go much longer than 3 days, because if you go without water for more than 3 days, it doesn't do you very good, does it? Your body starts to perish. But it's something that you don't undertake lightly. And for Paul, in the midst of this intense spiritual struggle, recognizing that he has found himself to be opposing God, a person who was so zealously committed to one side and then discovers that he was in the wrong place, it's a total fast that he needs to wait on God and to reflect and think through what's just happened to him. And I know from myself and personal experience that when you fast, your spiritual awareness is heightened or increased. When you fast, you hear the voice of God more clearly and easily. It's more easy to tune in spiritually. That's been my experience whenever I've fasted. And that's something that Paul needs at this moment as he contemplates and agonises over both his past and what his future will be. And I can imagine some of his prayers. God, I tried to destroy your church. How could I have been so blind? What a fool I've been. Show me the truth. I need to understand the truth about Christ. Give me a chance to redeem myself. These and similar prayers would have poured from his heart as he sought God and repented of what he had done. But we've got to leave Paul for a moment, because there's another character in the story we need to look at. In verse 10 we're introduced to a Damascus Christian called Ananias. And Ananias receives a vision in which he's told to go to Paul, and in a response to a vision that Paul has received, a similar vision, to place his hands on him and pray that his sight be restored. Now Ananias, as we can quite well understand, is naturally a little hesitant, because he's heard reports about the harm that this man Paul has done to the church. You've got to be kidding, God, I can imagine Ananias saying. He's been throwing people into prison. People have been killed because of this guy, and you want me to go and pray for him? You've got to be kidding. But God's very firm, isn't he? Go, he says to Ananias. And here's the reason why. For this man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel. So Ananias is faithful. He goes and he finds Paul, and he enters the house, and he walks right up to the man, and he places his hands on him and says, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me that you may see again, be filled with the Holy Spirit. And the moment he prays, something like scales fall from the eyes of Paul. His sight's restored. He gets up and he's baptized. Now I think this is quite a significant incident, and God has arranged it deliberately, we know, because he's given visions and he's asked Ananias to go and do this. Ananias is coming and praying for Paul as a confirmation of the vision that Paul received. How else would Ananias have known what happened to Paul on the road? It's obviously something from the hand of God. Secondly, it's a demonstration of God's power at work in the church. Ananias is a Christian disciple. He's a part of the church. So the church is obviously a vehicle for the plans of God. And thirdly, it is a Christian who brings healing to Paul. It is one of those whom he sought to destroy that is now his agent for healing. Now take a moment to think about that. I'm sure that during those 3 days that Paul was fasting, one of the questions that would have been going through his mind was, what's the church going to do with me? How is the church going to respond to me? I've been throwing family members into prison. I've even had some of them killed. How is the church going to respond to me? Will they accept me, or will they turn me away? I'm sure that's what Paul was asking himself. And the church did wrestle with those questions, we know. Would they believe that he was truly converted, or is this just another ploy to trap them? And that's why I believe Paul's blindness is significant, because it's through using Ananias, the Christian, to pray for Paul's healing that God also begins to reconcile Paul to the church. Ananias' first words to Paul were to call him brother. Brother Saul. He acknowledges and accepts that Paul has become a disciple, a Christian. Secondly, Paul is baptized. And baptism is the primary rite of initiation into the church. By being baptized, Paul has placed himself squarely in the Christian camp. We know that in countries where Muslims become Christians, that they might say they've been converted to faith, but it's not until they've actually been baptized that suddenly it can get very serious for them. Because baptism is that mark of committing yourself fully into the Christian faith. And it's only often Muslims who are baptized that often face martyrdom and serious persecution. So Paul is baptized, and lastly in verse 19 we're told that he has then become part of the Christian community in Damascus. He is accepted into their midst, becomes one of their number, and begins to argue the truth of the gospel in the synagogues. So what is the significance of Paul's conversion for us? I don't think, to be honest, you could imagine a man in many ways more or less likely, in a sense, to become a Christian. And yet God had plans for Paul. God had plans for this man from Tarsus. This man, we're told, is going to become a light to win the Gentiles. It is because of Paul's ministry to the Gentiles and into the nations of Europe that you and I are here today, worshipping in this place. Paul was the catalyst, and it was ministry that went up through Turkey and into Macedonia, into Rome, into Spain, that it was with the foundation of the church into those places. And through that, you and I are the heritage or the history of that. And it's because of Paul and his reasoning out of the Christian faith that we have such a major contribution to the New Testament today and all of his epistles. But there are three other things that stand out for me in the life of Paul. Firstly, there is no one who is so far from God that they cannot be restored. If Paul, the ravager of the church, could be saved, then so can that radical jihadist, or belligerent atheist, or distant relative, or difficult neighbour. And while I know we don't keep casting our pearls before swine, let's never give up too early on those to whom we have that chance to give the gospel. And so I'd encourage you to keep on praying for those with whom you have relationship and are connected who have not yet found Christ. I remember a young guy, one of our youth group members, who used to argue like mad, against Christianity. And I remember one day sitting with him, and I got very frustrated with him actually, and I was on the point of sort of giving up with him. And I said to him one day, what's stopping you from becoming a Christian? Instead of arguing all the red herrings with him, I just nailed him. And it was like he goes, oh, nothing, kind of thing, He went away and he gave his heart to Christ, and he's going on for the Lord over in Christchurch now. For a while there I thought this guy was just going to be a pain in the neck for the rest of his life. Just argue, red herrings. But I think it showed a questioning heart deep down. And when confronted and going past all the superficial arguments to the heart of the matter, he gave his heart to Christ. Let's not be too quick to jump to hasty judgments about people's openness to the gospel. Listen, be still, and listen to the voice of the Spirit, and knowing what to say and when to say it into people's lives. Secondly, the church's task is one of reconciliation. It's about reconciliation primarily between us and God, our Creator, but also between individuals. We are called to be at peace with others around us, as much as it relies on us. If you're not at peace with someone, and I don't care how they might have offended you, if you're not at peace with someone, you have a responsibility to seek to sort that out. And while they might not be willing to come to the party on your part, you have to do what you can, because that's what we're called to do as Christians. And if you haven't done that, that might be the reason why you're not hearing from God as clearly as you thought you should be. If we're not at peace to the best of our abilities with those around us, that will act as a barrier to you and your relationship with God, to hearing from God. So be reconciled with others. And lastly, every one of us, like Paul, have a call on our lives. If you're sitting in this place today as a person of faith, and God has a call on your life, you are a disciple. I prefer that term to Christian. You are a disciple, because a disciple doesn't just know what the master knows. A disciple does what the master does. We do what the master does. And Jesus' mission on this earth was to reconcile people to God. And each and every one of us, we're not going to all be evangelists, but the primary thing that we have been called to do is to go and make disciples. As much as is possible, to let our lives so shine in the places where we are that others can see the light of Christ in us and want to know more of Jesus. That's what we've been called to do. Every one of us. Let us pray.